everybody, and welcome. Welcome to Red Star Talks with me, Roger McKenzie, and my brother, my comrade, my friend, all that good stuff, Carlos Martinez, who we'll say a little bit about in a minute. But firstly, welcome, Carlos.
Nice one, Roger. Lovely to see you as always.
Yeah, you too, my brother. You too. Before I get into saying a little bit about Carlos and what we're going to talk about tonight, just a welcome to everybody who's coming to this podcast for the first time. You're very welcome. Please spread the word. The whole point of this podcast is not some sort of academic debate. What we're trying to do is to support action, to try and turn theory and discussion into people actually going out and organising and building the movement. I want to thank obviously Red Star Media, but also Manifesto Press, our lovely producer Rochelle, who's doing all the donkey work for this, but also, of course, the Morning Star, all supporters of this podcast. So Carlos Martinez, co-founder, co-editor, Friends of Socialist China, of which I am a committee member. So there is need to fess that right up front. I do have an interest, as we all should as socialists, actually, about what's going on in the world, but also I think in supporting the initiatives that have been taken by China. Also the author of The East is Still Red, China's Socialism in the 21st Century, but also a DJ, weirdly enough. I don't suppose that should be weird for anybody on the left to be interested in that. But before we talk a little bit about the DJ stuff, how did you get involved in politics, Carlos?
Right. Thanks very much for that very generous, unnecessarily generous introduction, Roger. Great to be here with you. I mean, I've been involved in the left for basically my entire adult life, and if I'm honest, and in the name of full disclosure, quite a lot of my childhood as well. I'm kind of some kind of variant of a red diaper baby, in the sense that my parents were involved in the Marxist-Leninist anti-revisionist movement, very much on the pro-China, pro-Mao Zedong side of things. My father was one of the top leaders of the Indian Workers Association, Great Britain, very active in London, especially in Southall, Woolwich, Plumstead, very active in Birmingham, in the Midlands generally.
Where I met him for the first time.
Right,
Many years ago.
Incredible.
Yeah.
So, a lot of my earliest memories include going to protests, going to meetings, being involved in support for the miners' strike. That was actually quite a historic thing, where the Indian community and the Caribbean community got organized in support of a predominantly white working class struggle, right? And I don't know if there's been any phenomenon in the history of the working class movement in this country that did so much to bring different communities together, break down barriers, and build a spirit of unity. So I was, around for that, albeit as a quite small child. I was around for, the anti-apartheid movement, Irish solidarity movement, Palestine solidarity movement. And I grew up in a culture that was basically in favor of socialism and that was anti-imperialist. So, when I got interested in politics for the first time, that was, all of that was sort of available. That was on the table. And reflecting on it, I suppose it was obviously not without its problems, but it did, I think, give me a fairly solid basic framework to understand the world. And when I was in my teens and early 20s, there were quite a few mobilizing factors, I think, that prompted me to get seriously involved rather than just be on the periphery, rather than just be interested. You'll remember, of course, the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence. You'll remember, of course, NATO's criminal war on Yugoslavia in 1999. 2001, the so-called war on terror, the rise in racism and Islamophobia that went along with that. Then, of course, 2003 and the invasion of Iraq. So, witnessing all of that, living through that period, I felt like I didn't have any option other than to get seriously involved.
Yeah, it was a really, because I'm kind of brought up politically, really, during that same sort of era, really. And I agree with you in terms of the impact of the miners' strike in particular and what that did. And way before that, and Aftab Bra would have been involved in the stuff before that as well, with the mobilisations around the East Midlands and around things like imperial typewriters and stuff like that, and the way that the National Front were involved and working hand in hand with not just the employer but also the trade union as well that was involved. And I remember particularly the way that communities came together during the miners' strike, but also importantly as well, quite often stayed together. A lot of those links continued beyond the miners' strike. We hear it famously with the in the film Pride, where there was that kind of link with the lesbian and gay community, but also I think that was with the black community. As well, it stayed with those communities that were standing, that took the often difficult step and unpopular step with the authorities of standing up for the miners. So I think that was a really kind of important era for political activity.
Yeah, and it was a game changer. Like, it marked a whole watershed where, as a movement, we started to understand the changing nature of the working class and the multinational, multi-ethnic nature of the working class. And there's precedent for that. That is a theme that runs throughout the working class movement in this country. If you look at 100 years ago, then a lot of the kind of vanguard of the working class movement was Irish or Irish origin, or Jewish origin. And the 1980s arrives. You had the miners' strikes. You had the uprisings in Brixton, in Toxteth, in Handsworth, and other places. And then you had a bit later on, you had the Grunwick workers' strikes. You had the Hillingdon Hospital workers' strikes, and you started to get that sense of, this is what a modern working class looks like. It's many different colours. It's many different kind of social backgrounds. But if we unite, if we all fight together on the same causes and on our common interests, then we can really achieve something meaningful. So it's a very important time, and I think it would behove us to recall it and to carry that spirit forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things, of course, that has always brought people together is music. So let's just deal with that. I mean, what music is it that you play?
Look, I've always played music. My mum was desperate for me to have music lessons because she had wanted to learn music as a child and hadn't been allowed to. And her brother had been, her brother was a very good flamenco guitar player.
All right.
So he'd been allowed to have music lessons. She really wanted music lessons and wasn't allowed to. So when I reached an appropriate age, which apparently was 5 or something, then she had me doing cello lessons. So that's always been a part of my life. When I was an early teenager, I got into guitar, played in bands and stuff like that. And then I just had a friend my first year at university up in Birmingham, who I was living with. He had a PC and he was really into producing jungle drum and bass, which is what we were all listening to. This is 1996. That's exactly what we were into. So I just got into it, got into making music, producing, running labels, and DJing just sort of came along with that. The last 15 years or so, mainly my music production has been based around hip-hop, and including some radical hip-hop under the name Agent of Change. So I've done some bits and pieces with Rebeldias, who are a Chilean origin group based in the US, based in New York and Chicago. Marcel Cartier, Jaziri X, produced a track or two for Loki, but the camera doesn't show it, but I've got a keyboard there and a couple of guitars right here. So that's, music's is and always has been a big part of my life.
Yeah, I've always and I think one of the things that's often maybe not talked about enough is that importance of music, bringing people together and crossing kind of artificial barriers that have been placed in front of us. So I think that's important. But of course, we could talk about music all night, and I could talk about my love of jazz and all the rest of it. But actually, what I invited you to come on to the show and talk about this evening is about China, obviously, given your expertise, which I've really admired. Actually, your grasp of what's happening in China, I think, is really admirable. But I suppose the starting point for that, and you've kind of touched on it a little bit already, is, in terms of all these different influences that you've had in your political activity. But why the major interest in China in particular?
Yeah, fair question. I mean, I've always been pretty interested in China. As I said, my parents were pro-China, albeit they were very critical of market reforms. They were very critical of the direction that China took from 1978. So after Mao's death, reform and opening up, et cetera, et cetera. And in that sense, that's a difference that I developed with them quite early on. But so yeah, I've always read about it, and Mao's selected works and things like that were this, those classic essays on philosophy, on practice, and on contradiction. That was kind of that, for me, that was like Peter and Jane. Do you know what I mean? That's the sort of thing that I was reading as a nerdy teenager. Okay, and then the last 10 years or so, in particular, I've been very much focused on that, and it just felt like a bit of a gap in the market, in the sense that you've got this country which is led by a communist party that calls itself socialist, which is doing amazing things. It's the world leader on poverty alleviation. It's the world leader on renewable energy and so on. It's the world leader in infrastructure development. People's living standards are continually improving. But, the Western left either ignores it or is hostile to it. Or at least it felt like that was the case 10 years ago. And maybe that's changing a little bit over the last few years. So I just felt, maybe I can play a useful role there. You also know my fellow co-editor at Friends of Socialist China, which is Keith Bennett. I've known him for a long time. He's been active since the early 1970s and always, from that time, always been oriented towards China. So we were working quite closely. And it just, it feels particularly important and particularly relevant at a time when capitalism, imperialism, neoliberalism are in a pretty deep, chronic crisis. And the US is responding to that crisis with the pursuit of a new Cold War against China and an escalation of its campaign, its long-term campaign of encirclement and containment of China. So it feels like it's important to raise understanding of China, build solidarity with China, showcase its successes, because we're socialists, we're communists, we're Marxists. Like, here are some successes of socialism. Here are some successes of Marxism. If we want to persuade people that they should try and build socialism where we are, right, in Britain, in this country, then it's helpful if we can showcase some examples of other places in the world where socialism has been a good thing, because that very much runs counter to this narrative that actually you can only thrive as a country, and you can only develop and you can only modernize under the auspices of capitalism and the Washington Consensus. And the other thing that's very important in relation to China is to counter the new Cold War, counter the propaganda war, which ultimately is a form of war propaganda, which is trying to build public support for hostility towards China, for a Cold War against China, and ultimately, in the not too distant future, very likely a hot war against China.
Yeah, I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about the domestic successes of China. I think. I mean, we obviously we went to China on the first of the Friends of Socialist China delegations, which was mind-boggling to me, frankly. It was awesome in terms of just seeing for myself some of the gains, some of the progress, the technology, the advances that China was making on a very, very personal level as a black person. One of the things that I always think about when I am asked to go anywhere is, will I feel comfortable? Will I feel as if I'm going to get harassed? Will I feel as though I'm going to get stared at all the time? And I can honestly say that I've been to China 3 times now, and each of those times, very different places, and probably the most comfortable I've felt anywhere on the planet that I've been to, and I've travelled quite extensively. And so I think that says a lot for the people of China. But also the government and the system out there is able to do that. One of the things for me was about its confidence as well as a country that I thought was great. As I said, we could spend a long, long time talking about those domestic successes, and you've mentioned some of those. But the thing that I really want to spend our time talking about is the foreign policy of China, given everything that's going on around the planet just now. And when this episode is aired, I don't know what the situation will be with Iran, but I wanted to lead us into just thinking generally about what that looks like and where that might be going. But I think a useful starting point might be to think about China's foreign policy now, really, because there's been some quite big announcements in recent months, really, about China's foreign policy and what its intentions are. Can you say a little bit about some of what China is aiming to do, what its kind of basic policies are in its foreign affairs?
Of course. And just to very quickly come back in on what you said about how you felt as a black man visiting China, it just really reminded me of Paul Robeson, his comments on visiting the Soviet Union for the first time. I think it was 1936. Maybe it was a little bit before that. I'd have to check. But, he commented very clearly that it was only in Moscow for the first time that I truly felt like a human being. And, these people had never seen a black person before. And yet they treated me immediately with dignity and respect. Of course, they were curious. Of course, they wanted to ask me questions. Of course, they wanted to find out about my life. But they treated me as an equal with dignity and respect. And it was something that I'd never experienced in the land of my birth. So very interesting to think about that parallel with China today. So China's foreign policy, am I allowed to take a few minutes and give you
sure.
a bit of a theoretical framework?
No, go for it.
It's a big topic, and we could talk about it for hours and hours. But I think, it's useful to understand that basic theoretical framework of China's foreign policy, right? And what it comes down to, like the most important foundations, are what's called the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which you obviously know about because you've written about them. But, when the socialist states, when the socialist world first came into existence in 1917, all of a sudden you have a question that arises, right? What kind of relations can you have between countries with fundamentally different social systems? Maybe in 1917, 1918, 1919, the people in the Soviet Union, or what was to become the Soviet Union, were thinking, well, there'll be world revolutions soon. There'll be a revolution in Germany, there'll be a revolution in Hungary, there'll be a revolution in France, in Poland. And gradually the workers' movement will spread and we'll have global socialism in a few years. I think by the early 20s, or certainly by the mid-20s, it was fairly clear that that wasn't going to be happening. And you had to find a way of moving forward and developing relations between countries such that they can cooperate and accept their differences. And so that was Lenin's kind of answer to that situation, was this notion of peaceful coexistence, right? And after a couple of decades, like by the 1950s, this was clearly this had become a long-term reality. It wasn't a temporary situation anymore, you know. And I think we're still very clearly in that epoch, the epoch of states of very different social systems having to coexist. And so China's theoretical contribution at that time was to elevate this tactic, if you will, of peaceful coexistence into a whole broadly applicable theoretical framework, which came to be called the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence. It was first enunciated by Premier Zhou Enlai back in 1954 and announced together with the Indian Prime Minister at the time, Jawaharlal Nehru, at Panchshir in India. Why? In India it's called the Panchshir Principles. And those principles are mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. And then just a year later, those were adopted and expanded into 10 principles at the Bandung Conference, the Afro-Asian Conference in 1955. And they became the founding principles of the non-aligned movement. They've been incorporated into international law. And you know, I think to this day, they provide a sort of de facto template for relations between states, right? And there's a couple of very important insights that come out of that. One is that countries with completely different political and economic systems, they might be socialist, they might be capitalist, they might be religious, they might be secular, but they can coexist and they must coexist if we're going to have any kind of peace, right? If we're going to avoid world war and constant conflict. The second important insight, and particularly for our purposes, is that all of the countries of the global south, all socialist countries, all oppressed and formerly oppressed countries, or all, you know, if you like, non-imperialist countries, however different from each other, they share a common interest in opposing imperialism and having the freedom to explore, you know, a development path that suits their own conditions, their own traditions, right? And I think, yeah, look, fast forwarding to the current era, you know, the 5 principles, as applied on a new basis of today's reality, and incorporating the changes that have taken place over the last decades, you know, incorporating the collective rise of the global south in particular, can be summed up in this idea of multilateralism or multipolarity, or what the Chinese have come to call building a community of shared future for humanity, what Xi Jinping calls an open, inclusive, clean and beautiful world that enjoys lasting peace, universal security and common prosperity. You know, maybe your listeners will be surprised to know that that's a Xi Jinping quote and not a Donald Trump quote. And you know, China's building out the organizational infrastructure for that. You know, that's what the Belt and Road does. You know, that's a key kind of practical vehicle for this shared future. China's obviously core to the BRICS, which has now got 10 members, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Indonesia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Ethiopia, and the BRICS is big now. You know, the BRICS surpasses the G7 in terms of GDP, in terms of population, in terms of landmass. And that's a big change, because those countries collectively, their economy was about 30% of the size of the G7 just 20, 25 years ago. So this is a huge shift that we're seeing. China's very much involved in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in the G77 plus China, obviously. It has very close ties with all the big regional organizations, the African Union, CELAC, ASEAN. So you've got these emerging centers of power, and we're moving towards a sort of negotiated international order in which no single country, no single block of countries is able to impose its will on the rest, right? All countries enjoy sovereign equality. All countries get to have a say in global affairs. And like, in a sense, there's nothing really new in this. I mean, it's just a reiteration of the principles of the United Nations Charter, right? You read the UN Charter, this is basically what it says. You know, this is the foundations of international law. But the difference is we've actually got a trajectory for it happening now. And it's urgently needed, right? You know, without this, without international law, without adherence to the UN Charter, without multilateralism, without sovereign equality and peaceful coexistence, we're not going to deal with the climate catastrophe. We're not going to deal with the potential for nuclear war. We're not going to deal with future pandemics, with antimicrobial resistance, with the dangers of like uncontrolled artificial intelligence. I mean, there's a lot of scary things that face humanity, and that we can only deal with as humanity collectively, right, through global cooperation. So we've got this trajectory. The US, the empire, and its allies are obviously not happy with this trajectory. They're not happy with the idea that the unipolar moment is ending. They're not happy with the idea that the end of history has ended. Like that's how I would characterize this period we're living through. It's the end of history, right? 1991 came around, the Soviet Union had collapsed, the Eastern European people's democracies had collapsed, neoliberalism had won, the Washington Consensus had won, and Francis Fukuyama said that, well, we've arrived at the end of history now. Liberal democracy is the thing, it's the end point for humanity. This is how human communities must organize themselves. Like that's fallen apart, right? And that's being replaced by a multilateral, multipolar trajectory. But the US isn't going to just accept that passively, right? And it's all there. It's all there in the theory. It's all there in the Wolfowitz doctrine. It's all there in Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard, which was written in 1997, where he says, it's imperative that no Eurasian challenger emerges. And he talks about specifically the most dangerous scenario being a grand coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran. Fast forward 3 decades, that's kind of exactly what's happening, right?
Yeah.
So the US is responding to all of this with its proxy war against Russia and in Ukraine, its military encirclement of China, AUKUS, the Pacific build-up, its provocations in relation to Taiwan, its unconditional support for Israel, its tariff wars, its semiconductor export controls, its financial sanctions, it's this whole new Cold War framework, this Monroe Doctrine reasserted as a Donroe Doctrine in Latin America, and we can see what they've been doing in Venezuela, kidnapping a president and the first combatant of that country, Nicolas Maduro and Cilia Flores. We can see what they're trying to starve Cuba into submission, imposing a brutal criminal blockade, energy blockade on the country. And now with the war in Iran, the US it may be losing its economic primacy, it may be losing its technological primacy, but it still retains overwhelming military power, right? And it's a cornered imperial power. It's a trapped animal that's reaching for whatever solutions it can find, and those solutions are military solutions. So where does that leave us in terms of China's policy? I would say China's strategy in broad terms is unite the global South through win-win cooperation based on sovereignty, based on mutual respect, based on mutual benefit, based on non-interference, right? Build relationships with the so-called intermediate zone, right? Europe, Canada, and others, like secondary powers, to, build trade relationships with them that are of benefit to the people in those countries, to neutralize them as far as possible, right? So that they're not firmly in the US camp. And I think we can see this playing out now with like the Mark Carney's speech in Davos and the flurry of European leaders visiting Beijing. Avoid falling into the US's traps, because the US has set traps and it's going to continue setting traps for China. China has to maintain a defensive military posture to deter aggression, but it can't get bogged down into the traps that are set for it. China has to maintain an orientation towards peace. And this is another thing that Xi Jinping always says: without peace, nothing is possible, right? China needs to serve as a builder and a guardian of peace. And this is the fundamental differentiator between China and the US, right? The US is a war machine. China hasn't been at war in nearly 50 years. The US is a global bully. China is a global friend, a global partner. So China's strategy is to keep on pushing towards a multilateral, more equal, more democratic world order in which Asia has a say, Africa has a say, Latin America has a say, the Caribbean has a say, the Pacific has a say, whilst, of course, being permanently vigilant in relation to, as we've said, a declining US empire that remains the world's only military superpower, and that's lashing out, and that's revived it's a whole better dead than red mentality, and is reviving all the racist pseudoscience that went with the original colonial era, and even the tactics and strategy of the original colonial era. The gunboat diplomacy. You look at what they're doing to Cuba. You look at the build up against Venezuela in December last year, and January this year. It's classic gunboat diplomacy. You'd think that it was China in the 1830s, British gunboats trying to impose their policy and trying to impose opium on the people of China.
There's a kind of new, well, it's not a new kid on the block. It's a kid that's been on the block before with China, Japan, and the rise of the or the re-emergence maybe of the far right, the new prime minister in Japan making noises about Taiwan. I mean, how do you see? I mean, we'll get on to. There's load to pick out from what you've said, but as that's just come into my mind, I wanted to just get your view about that relationship. Critical relationship, I'd say, between China and Japan, and the way that Japan seems to be being wound up by the US to be their kind of front guard, I suppose. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, the situation with Japan hasn't changed all that much since the end of World War II. And certainly, the late 1940s and early 50s, in the sense that Japan was specifically allowed to rebuild. It was allowed to not deal with its militarism problem. It was allowed to not deal with its fascism problem. Like, the Japanese state wasn't meaningfully restructured. There was no equivalent of like a denazification program in Japan, right? And Japan's economic development was very much fomented and cultivated by the US so that it could play this role of being a bastion of the US-led imperialist system in East Asia, and so that it could play that role of permanent physical and economic opposition to the Soviet Union and to People's China and to People's Korea, right? And Japan from the very beginning has been considered part of the Truman administration's first island chain against China, which also includes Taiwan. So, in a sense, Takaichi, who's this extremely hawkish new prime minister of Japan, is voicing sentiments that have been latent in Japan for a very long time, and it's kind of like taking a side in a shifting situation, in a situation where the world is experiencing what the Chinese call changes unseen in a century, i.e., it's on the one hand, you've got this multipolar trajectory, and you've got the emergence of the global south and a dying imperialism. On the other hand, you've got the neoconservatism and the ideas of the project for a new American century, which is what's coming out of the Republican Party in particular. But to be honest, the Democrats aren't much different. If we look at the 4 years of Biden administration, I can't see that we saw any meaningful pivot there. Japan is essentially very loudly, very clearly, unambiguously picking a side. And they're saying, the side we pick is the United States. We're going to hitch our wagon to that particular train. So now, Takaichi for the first time has explicitly said that if the People's Republic of China were to attempt to change the status quo along the Taiwan Straits, i.e., if they were to attempt to reabsorb Taiwan province by force, then Japan's national security would be compromised, and Japan would have no alternative but to get involved militarily. So they are basically saying that they would go to war against China in that situation, which is a massive violation of the One China principle. It's a massive violation of international law. It's a massive violation of China's sovereignty, and it's a massive violation of all of the agreements between Beijing and Tokyo, right?
So some people listening and watching this might not know about the One China principle. Could you just say quickly what that is?
Oh, so the One China principle is simply that there is one country called China, and its capital is in Beijing. So that means that there's not two countries called China. After 1945, Taiwan had been a Japanese colony for about 50 years. As part of the post-war agreements, as part of the discussions at Cairo and at Potsdam, Taiwan was returned to Chinese control in 1945. China was, at that time, was the Republic of China, and its government was led by the Kuomintang, by Chiang Kai-shek. Then a civil war took place between 1946 and 1949. The Kuomintang lost. They went running to Taiwan province, which is an island, as you know, and they set up, a kind of renegade state, basically, with, comparatively speaking, a tiny population, much smaller. But from that time, from 1949, basically, because of the US's domination of the United Nations, until 1971, so fully 22 years, that Republic of Taiwan, i.e. Republic of China, i.e. Taiwan, was held China's seat in the United Nations General Assembly and the United Nations Security Council. So it was kind of internationally recognized under international law as China. Obviously, de facto, China was China. No one seriously thought that Taiwan and the Chiang Kai-shek's dictatorship represented a billion people in China. But the point is, China won its seat at the UN back in 1971, principally with the support of the Global South countries, and most importantly of all, with the support of the African countries. And around the same sort of time, the US and China started on their rapprochement, and the US agreed to sign up to the One China policy. And so that's agreed now at international law level. And I think of 193 UN member states, about 182 or 183 have diplomatic relations with Beijing and not with Taipei, right? So that's the One China policy. So the Japanese are steadily trying to undermine the One China policy and negate it. Meanwhile, there's very loud voices talking about getting rid of Japan's post-war peace constitution, whereby they can only develop their military with an aim to defend their territory and not use it aggressively. There's very loud voices talking about the development of nuclear weapons in Japan, which is an extremely, extremely dangerous development. And, Japan has civilian nuclear energy and advanced nuclear science field. Like, if the Japanese decided that they wanted to develop nuclear weapons, it probably wouldn't, it probably wouldn't take them very long to do so. So that's a very serious worry in terms of non-proliferation. But yeah, that's what the Japanese ruling class is doing at this point. It's decided to hitch its wagon to the US train. It's making this loyalty pledge to the US. It's saying, we're here for you. We know that a war with China is coming, and we're going to be on your side. We're not going to be on their side.
I mean, you said, that's really, really helpful, really clear. I mean, you said earlier on about China not falling into traps that have been set for it by the US and the US's mates, basically, or posse, as I call them. I suppose for me, one of the things that's worth spelling out a little bit is that the kind of traps that appear to me to be being laid around Iran, but also around Cuba, Venezuela as well, all friends, collaborators in various different ways within organizations like BRICS. And it was actually something that was raised to me with me over the weekend by somebody in family as well, because they said, "Oh, you've been to China a few times," and but I thought China was friends with Iran and friends with Cuba and friends with Venezuela. Why haven't they done anything? And that's what and I think it's worth just dealing with that sort of straight up, really. I mean, how can we answer that?
Yeah, well, as the joke goes, how do you get to Warsaw? Well, I wouldn't start from here. Um, like, this is a really important, and actually it's a really difficult and a really complicated question, and we shouldn't treat it lightly. And we're not, in the course of a few minutes, we're not going to get to a sort of comprehensive answer, but hopefully we can touch on a few useful ideas. Firstly, I think it is important to recognise that this war, brutal criminal war, waged with no, not even the slightest nod to the United Nations, not even the slightest nod to international law. It's a fascistic type of war, fascistic type of behaviour by the US and by Israel. It's a war in Iran, and Iran is being punished because it is a sovereign state, because it defends its sovereignty, because it doesn't follow the Washington Consensus, because it doesn't follow neoliberalism, because it insists on maintaining control of its natural resources, most of which are nationalized, by the way, because it is the world's biggest state supporter of Palestine, because it's a proud and dignified nation that, generally speaking, does not go along with US diktat, and the West can't handle that, right? So it is a war in Iran, but it's also a war on Palestine, because the Iranian support has been absolutely indispensable to the Palestinian resistance and the Palestinian national movement in general ever since 1979. The Iran under the Shah dictatorship up until 1979 was an ally of Israel. Gave no support whatsoever to Palestine. From 1979 onwards, that changed immediately, and that's been the case for the last 47 years, that Iran became a major, absolutely critical, indispensable supporter of Palestine. So this war in Iran is also a war on Palestine. And if you oppose the war on the Palestinian people, if you oppose the genocide in Gaza, you should also defend Iran, by the way. It's a war on the axis of resistance in the region and globally. It's a war on Yemen. It's a war on Iraq. It's a war on Hezbollah in Lebanon. As I say, it's a war on Palestine. And it's a war on this whole multilateral, multipolar trajectory that we've been talking about, which makes it a war on China, which makes it a war on Russia, which makes it a war on Africa, on the Belt and Road, on BRICS, on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran and China have extremely deep, extremely extensive economic relations. Iran's a very important source of oil and gas to China. They've got wide-ranging cooperation on, other than energy, infrastructure, transport, technology, military. So, the US is looking, and this is very, very similar to Venezuela and very similar to the notion of colonizing or recolonizing Greenland. A lot of this is about seizing control of energy flows. The US kind of according itself the power to just impose energy blockades on China or Russia, in the event of a hot war, developing these strategic choke points. So, the war in Iran really fits into this category of like the Empire Strikes Back that we were talking about a few minutes ago. It's a part of a desperate attempt to disrupt this trajectory towards a more equal and democratic world order and to disrupt China's rise. And it does, highlight some of these deep problems, some of these deep contradictions of the current moment we're living in, where the US is declining, but it's still the military superpower that can, in a sense, do what it wants at a military level. It's not like China and Russia can just stop in. It's not like they've got a magic wand whereby they can just project their power globally.
Exactly.
China is supporting Iran to the best of its abilities, I would say. It's supporting it diplomatically. Immediate condemnation of the military strikes, immediate condemnation of the extrajudicial murder of Ali Khamenei, demands that Iran's sovereignty, that its territorial integrity be respected. Its ambassador to the United Nations, Fu Sung, said clearly, unambiguously, this is a violation of international law. And okay, diplomacy is diplomacy, words are words, but it's a lot better than what we got from other countries, right? It's a lot better than what we got from Keir Starmer or MERS or Macron.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, who've issued no condemnation of the US. They've issued no condemnation of Israel. In fact, they're basically, MERS in particular has said, well, this is good. We should be doing this. Great idea, Israel. Great idea, United States. And instead, they condemn Iran for defending itself. Beyond diplomacy, obviously, China and Iran have a very vast trade relationship and investment relationship. China's been a major contributor to Iran's economic strength over the last 20 years. And it's provided that economic support in the face of brutal, wide-ranging sanctions. There's military relationship. China supplies missiles, it supplies air defense systems, it supplies training and more. And reports are coming out that the Russians are providing intelligence to Iran at the moment about the location of enemy troops and enemy missiles, enemy bases. But China does not have a global infrastructure of power projection. China's defensive posture is, that's a clear limiting factor here. China's military is set up to defend China's shores and to protect its interests in the region. It's not set up to send dozens of warplanes or aircraft carriers over to the Persian Gulf, where the Americans would would attack it immediately, right? Like, there's nothing useful in a direct military sense that China can do. The other thing is, not being funny, Iran's a sovereign country.
Yeah, exactly.
Iran doesn't actually need other countries to come to its aid militarily. Iran doesn't want to be a colony of Israel. It doesn't want to be a colony of the United States, but it also doesn't want to feel that it's a province of Russia or a province of China. Iran has known that this war is coming. Iran has been preparing for this war for years, if not decades. And Iran, I think, is doing a pretty great job of defending itself, and we should thank the Iranians, thank the Iranian people, and thank the Iranian military on behalf of all of, decent humanity that they're doing that they're giving the Israelis a bloody nose, that they're giving the Americans a bloody nose. The people of Tel Aviv are finding out what Iran can do right now. The people of Haifa, of Eilat, are finding out what Iran can do. Anyone near a military base in Qatar, in the UAE, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, etc., they're finding out, So Iran is a fiercely independent country, and it's able to fight its own battles. It's a very, very difficult, very, very precarious situation. But, I think, in a sense, to expect that China or Russia will come in and save the situation and then criticize them for not doing things that are manifestly not within their control is just a cop-out. We've got a job. We live in the countries that are launching this attack. We're in Britain, we're in the US, we're in Europe, etc., etc. We need to be coming out onto the streets. We need to be doing everything we can to prevent our governments from supporting this criminal aggression. Britain's just sent its HMS Dragon, or whatever it's called, from Portsmouth to Cyprus, where it's going to protect a British base in Cyprus from which US airplanes are launching their attacks on Iran. Why are we out in the streets in our millions making sure that doesn't happen? Those bases need to be closed down.
Absolutely. And bases that increasingly the people of Cyprus don't want anywhere near them as well. Very definition, I suppose, of interfering in other people's countries and imposing yourselves on them. I thought that was I think that's a really helpful kind of analysis of the position that we face, a kind of dose of reality, really, in terms of what the actual situation is for countries like China and Russia. I mean, there's so much more we can talk about, and I hope you'll come back at some point and we can kind of develop some of these issues. For me, the kind of final bits of what you just said there in terms of what we need to do in countries like Britain and in Germany and the US and elsewhere, in terms of coming out on the streets and standing up and building the peace movement, and putting the pressure on, and getting people like actually we did for the demonstrations in support of the Palestinians. Thousands and thousands of people coming out and marching and protesting for the very first time, people who'd never been out on a march before, whole families who'd never marched before, but they saw the injustice of what was happening, and came out and marched. And I think that's our kind of historic role, if that's not too grand a description, is kind of what I think we need to do. I want to kind of come to a close. I know, should have said this at the beginning, I know you're not too well and I've taken up a load of your time, but I found this discussion to be really full. And
it's been a joy, Roger. It's restorative. It's all the medicine I need.
Where can people connect with your work?
So, well, yeah, as we mentioned, I'm one of the editors of Friends of Socialist China. That's principally a website, socialistchina.org. I do a bit of writing on the Socialist China website. I've got a blog that I'm trying to revive, which is called Invent the Future, invent-the-future.org. This book, which you mentioned earlier, The East is Still Red, is something that can be procured. There's another book, People's China at 75, that was edited jointly by me and Keith Bennett, which I think is a useful read. I got another book that came out in 2019 about the collapse of the Soviet Union, called The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse. And I'm on social media, Twitter, X, formerly known as Twitter.
Yeah.
I can't, this whole formerly known as thing, I can't use those words now without thinking of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, formerly known as Prince Andrew. I mention X, formerly known as Twitter, and then all of a sudden, all I'm thinking about is Pizza Express in Guildford. So I'm on X, agent_of_change, and I'm around. You can find me.
People can. We'll put all of this stuff in the kind of show notes as well. But again, can I thank you so much for getting off your sick bed basically and coming and joining me for this chat. Can I thank Manifesto Press for helping to do all the production for this, Red Star Media as well, and the Morning Star, and everybody who is watching this. Please press that like button and share it out, and make sure the more people press that like button, the more we can get around some of the algorithms that exist on these sort of platforms that we're forced to be on. But word of mouth, there's nothing better than that. So let other people know, share this out when you see it, and let's get as many people watching this. But what I always say on this program is that don't just watch this and say, well, that was good, and then just kind of flick on to the next thing. What we need to do is kind of what Carlos was saying, let's go out and build the movement. Let's go out and make sure that we're doing stuff to make a difference. So can I thank you again, Carlos? Can I thank everybody for spending your time watching this, and just implore everybody in these hard, tough times, stay safe and stay cool and listen to music, because it does help. If you can't listen to the techno stuff that Carlos is into, then Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, they're really good for these moments in time. Thanks, comrades.
Outrageous mischaracterization, bordering on slander, just when things are going so well. No, I just wanted to say thanks very much, Roger. Really appreciate you inviting me on the show, and just thanks for all the great work you do. Keep going. We're with you.
No, you keep going too. We all need to stand together. Take care, comrades. Stay well, stay cool, stay safe. Bye now.